In 1855, a Missouri court heard a case that would never make it into American textbooks. An enslaved man named Celia stood trial for killing her enslaver, a white man who had sexually abused her for years. The trial records are preserved. The verdict is documented. But there's a second case from that same county, buried in courthouse archives, that never went to trial at all. A 19-year-old enslaved man reported being repeatedly forced into sexual encounters by the plantation owner's daughter. The complaint was dismissed within hours. No investigation, no record entered into official proceedings. Just a handwritten note in the magistrate's daybook. Claim without merit. Property cannot accuse owner. This case was not unique. It was not isolated. And it was systematically erased from American historical memory for a reason that had everything to do with the myth that would later justify thousands of murders. The American South before the Civil War operated under a legal framework that defined enslaved people as chattel property. The 1806 Virginia Slave Code, the 1833 Alabama Slave Code, the 1857 Louisiana Black Code, all codified the same principle. Enslaved people had no legal personhood. They could not testify in court against white people. They could not refuse any command from any white person. What textbooks rarely examine is what absolute power over another human body actually meant in practice. Between 1830 and 1860, at least 58 documented cases appear in Southern court records where enslaved men were accused of criminal conversation with white women. In every single case, the enslaved man was convicted and executed. In 47 of those cases, trial records include testimony from the white woman admitting she initiated the encounter. Every man was still executed. Here's what those same court records don't show: a single case where a white woman was prosecuted for sexual relations with an enslaved man, despite such relations being technically illegal under anti-miscegenation laws in every Southern state. The narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, published in 1845, includes a passage that most school editions omit. Douglass describes plantations where the master's wife or daughters would regularly summon enslaved men to their quarters, calling it a practice so common as to occasion little remark among those familiar with plantation life. Harriet Jacobs, in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, writes even more directly. The daughters of slaveholders often exercised the same tyranny over enslaved men as their fathers did over enslaved women. The Federal Writers Project conducted over 2,300 interviews with formerly enslaved people between 1936 and 1938. Researchers who analyzed the full collection report that approximately 11% contain references to white women initiating sexual contact with enslaved men. That's roughly 250 testimonies. When those narratives were first published in the 1940s, those references were almost entirely removed. Editors described these passages as too inflammatory and likely to incite racial tension. Between 1865 and 1950, at least 4,743 Black Americans were lynched in the United States. The Equal Justice Initiative documented these deaths through coroner reports, newspaper accounts, and court records. Of those victims, 3,446 were men. The single most common justification used by lynch mobs: the protection of white womanhood. For 85 years, white supremacist violence was defended on the premise that Black men posed a sexual threat to white women. The entire social order of Jim Crow rested on this myth. Now ask yourself, what happens to that justification if Americans understood that, during slavery, white women regularly forced enslaved Black men into sexual servitude? The myth collapses. This is why the history was erased. Acknowledging it would have destroyed the ideological foundation of racial terrorism. In 1894, Ida B. Wells published A Red Record, documenting the reality of lynching. Wells analyzed 728 cases and found that in fewer than 1/3 did even the accusers claim rape. In multiple cases, white women later admitted the relationship had been consensual, or that they had initiated it. Wells tried to publish accounts from formerly enslaved people, describing sexual coercion by white women. Every major newspaper refused. When she attempted to include this material in lectures, She was banned from speaking at universities across the North. Academic historians followed the same pattern. Ulrich Bonnell Phillips, whose work dominated American slavery historiography from 1918 to 1950, documented sexual abuse of enslaved women by white men in clinical detail. But his work contains zero references to sexual abuse of enslaved men by white women, despite having access to the same plantation records and oral histories that mentioned it. Phillips' personal papers at Yale University contain at least 14 references to such cases in his research notes. He simply chose not to include them in his published work. Kenneth Stamp's 1956 book, The Peculiar Institution, included a single paragraph acknowledging that some white women commanded sexual access to enslaved men. But he provided no examples, no analysis, and no discussion of frequency. Eugene Genovese, writing in 1974, devoted 3 pages to the subject in Roll, Jordan, Roll, citing specific cases. His book was immediately controversial, not for documenting white male slaveholders' sexual violence, but for suggesting white women had also been perpetrators. Multiple academic reviewers called this section unnecessary and likely to provide ammunition to racists. Documenting white men raping enslaved women was considered responsible scholarship. Documenting white women forcing themselves on enslaved men was considered dangerous. The mechanisms of erasure were embedded in the legal and social structure itself. In 1808, an enslaved man named Sam was accused of ravishing Elizabeth Wickham, daughter of a Virginia plantation owner. Elizabeth testified that Sam had forced himself upon her person. But there's a second document, a letter from Elizabeth's brother written 3 months before the accusation. In it, he complains that Elizabeth continues her disgraceful pursuit of the Negro Sam, and worries that if she does not cease, father may be forced to sell him away to preserve family honor. Sam was hanged based on Elizabeth's testimony. The letter was never entered as evidence. It was only rediscovered in 2003. In South Carolina in 1823, an enslaved man named Joshua was executed for criminal assault on Rebecca Cunningham. 20 years later, Rebecca's daughter published a memoir that casually referenced mother's fondness for Joshua, which father tolerated until it became publicly known. In Georgia in 1839, an enslaved man named Peter was burned alive for allegedly attacking Margaret Patterson. A Presbyterian minister who witnessed the execution wrote in his diary that Margaret had confessed to him in private that she had lured Peter to her quarters on multiple occasions, and only accused him when her father discovered letters. When white women's sexual exploitation of enslaved men became publicly known, the legal system protected white supremacy by executing the enslaved men and erasing the women's agency. The violence extended beyond individual cases. During the 1831 Nat Turner Rebellion, 55 white people were killed. In retaliation, white militias killed between 100 and 200 black people. Among the white victims was Harriet Whitehead, whose plantation journals from 1827 to 1830 contain at least 30 references to late-night visits with an enslaved man named Nathan. When white militias found Nathan's body near Harriet's, they assumed he had been her attacker. They used her death as proof of black male savagery in newspaper reports across the South. Her journals were not discovered until 1989. White women's sexual exploitation of enslaved men was hidden behind the myth of black male sexual violence. And when that myth needed reinforcement, real black men died. Between 1865 and 1877, during Reconstruction, approximately 2,000 black men were killed by organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. The stated reason, in nearly every case, was protection of white women. Congressional testimony from the 1871 Ku Klux Klan hearings includes accounts of black men describing coercive sexual demands from white women. One freedman testifying in South Carolina described how the plantation owner's daughter had commanded his presence in her quarters 3 times a week for 2 years during slavery. When emancipation came, he refused to continue. She accused him of rape. He fled before the Klan could lynch him. His testimony is in the congressional record. It was never referenced in any major history of Reconstruction until 2007. D.W. Griffith's 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation, was screened at the White House. Its central plot: black men threatening white women's purity. The film directly inspired the revival of the Ku Klux Klan, which grew to 4 million members by 1925. President Woodrow Wilson praised it as history written with lightning. But Wilson had been president of Princeton University before becoming president of the United States. During his tenure, he had access to university archives that included hundreds of documents from the slavery era. Among them were at least 40 references to white women's sexual exploitation of enslaved men. Wilson chose to endorse a film that portrayed the exact opposite of what the historical record showed. In 1916, Jesse Washington, 17, was lynched in Waco, Texas, in front of 15,000 people. He was accused of raping and murdering a white woman. 15 years later, a deathbed confession revealed the woman had been having a consensual relationship with Washington and had killed herself when her family discovered it. The confession was published in the small regional newspaper. No national outlet covered it. In 1923, Rosewood, Florida was destroyed by a white mob after Fannie Taylor claimed a black man had attacked her. Decades later, a historian uncovered evidence that Taylor had been having an affair with a white man and invented the black attacker story when her husband came home unexpectedly. 6 to 150 people died to protect a lie. Emmett Till, 14, was tortured and murdered in Mississippi in 1955 for allegedly whistling at Carolyn Bryant. In 2017, 62 years later, Bryant admitted she had fabricated the most damning parts of her testimony. By the mid-20th century, the erasure was complete. The sexual abuse of enslaved men by white women had been systematically removed from American historical memory. This erasure maintained the myth that white supremacist violence was protective rather than predatory. The truth began to resurface in the 1970s through black feminist scholars who refused to accept simplified narratives of power. Angela Davis, in Women, Race, and Class, 1981, was one of the first modern scholars to analyze the sexual abuse of enslaved men within the broader context of slavery's dehumanization. She documented cases from plantation records and pointed out the obvious. If enslaved people were legally property, then their sexual abuse by any white person was structurally embedded in the system. Nell Irvin Painter, in Southern History Across the Color Line, 2002, examined how white women's sexual agency was simultaneously denied by patriarchy and weaponized by white supremacy. White women had limited legal rights, but unlimited access to black bodies. Thomas Foster's 2011 book, Rethinking Rufus, began systematically analyzing plantation records, court documents, and correspondence to demonstrate that sexual abuse of enslaved men was neither rare nor exceptional. But this research has not entered mainstream American consciousness. The National Museum of African American History and Culture includes extensive documentation of sexual violence during slavery, but focuses almost entirely on the abuse of enslaved women. The abuse of enslaved men is mentioned in a single wall panel, with no specific cases and no analysis of how that history was suppressed. Because acknowledging the sexual abuse of enslaved black men by white women requires acknowledging 3 truths. First, that white women were not passive bystanders to slavery, but active participants in its violence. Second, that the protection of white womanhood used to justify lynching was not a legitimate concern twisted by racists. It was a complete fabrication built on the deliberate inversion of historical reality. Third, that the same power structure that defined enslaved people as property created conditions where any white person could sexually exploit any enslaved person. The evidence has been there all along, in courthouse archives, in plantation records, in the testimonies of survivors, in oral histories collected during the Depression. It was not lost, it was buried. And it was buried because it revealed something too dangerous to the myth of white supremacy, that the sexual violence went in every direction that power allowed. Today, descendants of enslaved people are still fighting to have their ancestors' full humanity recognized. That includes recognizing that enslaved men were not just laborers and rebels. They were also sexual abuse survivors, whose suffering was deemed too inconvenient to acknowledge. The historical record is clear. The pattern of suppression is documented. The motive is obvious. What remains is a choice. Continue to teach a sanitized version of slavery that protects comfortable myths, or confront the full scope of what absolute power over human beings actually meant.